Anyway, sorry. But there are words that I tend to use when I describe the Rococo, which are words like organic, curvilinear, natural, to try to describe how they're envisioning the world around them. If we think about that idea of the Baroque, which was incredibly heavy, which was sort of this new vision of the glory of God, perhaps, the heaviness and the weight of it is going to melt away. We're talking in everything. We're talking furniture, we're talking architecture, we're talking colors, we're talking clothing, we're talking textiles. The heaviness will start to melt away, but we will keep little elements of the classicism of it and start to redevelop it into, and I hasten to say this because everything is beautiful, but a more beautifully considered style. And we often, what makes this period really interesting to me is that all the things architecturally, fine art, all sort of find their way to play on each other in a way in which specific furniture kind of goes along with the dress, and the interior goes along with the furniture, and the architectural devices, which we'll talk about soon, changes in many ways to become a cohesive double mask, new mask. There we go. To almost become, like we think about when we talk about design, a cohesive idea for visuals that are around us. Does that make sense? And it's so different because, we talk about clothes, but we can't not look at interiors and how all the things sort of are creating this theatricality that all coordinates in a lot of ways, in a way that we really haven't seen before. And it's thought about. The period, the Enlightenment, certainly brings forward a great deal, as I mentioned in the lecture, in how people interact. And certainly previous to this, we even think about the Cavalier, the idea of brute force was dominant, right? Now, the intellect is dominant. And with the intellect, the wit, the understanding of life becoming dominant, that means certainly, because we know women have equal intellectual capacities, that we start to see women take on a presence of, and I say this carefully, philosophical equality, that they are welcome to the conversations and in many ways introduced and accepted into the conversation in a way that has never really been done before, which is exceptionally interesting to me, because we also see a freedom in the clothes in a way that we will not see before. And when we talk about big picture costume, clothing, up until this point, it's been like focused on men, right? Lots of little pieces, all with different names, changing quickly. This is where I see the big switch happening. Where from this point on, the GOWNE, this kind of all catch-all word for the things that we put on our body that are basically bodice and skirts, starts to be really envisioned into a fashionable idea, which then carry names to it. We see a switch. I mentioned this when we talked about restoration, that this is kind of where we stop really thinking about men. Because the terms and the ideas of the clothes that they put on their body kind of stay the same. It's now just silhouette, just like we saw with women in the first part of the semester, right? We had to focus on the silhouette before we really got the name. Okay, I'm assigning mantua to this just to make it easier for you, but really they just call it gown. Now we get special names for this. So our emphasis on fashion, especially, will now turn in a lot of cases to gender divides in some ways. And we will see, not so much this time, but we will see people playing with gender and the ideas of what are men's clothes, what are women's clothes, and we will even start to see similarly to maybe Elizabethan, this idea of men's, what we would traditionally call men's inspired women's clothes or tailored inspired clothing. So it's kind of exciting. It's also ridiculously beautiful. And in a lot of ways, I use that because of that cohesiveness. It really connects to the designer in me, where it feels like the presentation is thorough. The art, the dresses, the world feels thought. And so it's very exciting to me. The individual pieces are also really immaculate and beautiful and exciting that way too, okay? So part one, keep that in mind as we're talking about the things we're talking about today. The second thing I want you to think about is what? What would I want you to think about first? I'll think of it in a second. My brain went for a little walk. We have other things planned. So, ready for bad drawings? So on to bad drawings. Bad drawings, excellent. So our menswear, which is all the way over here, is predominantly the same silhouette in a lot of ways. It's just little details are going to evolve to make it much more current, okay? We're still going to see predominantly justacore, waistcoat, breeches, cravat. What am I wearing today? You know, I don't have my justacore on per se, but if I had my suit jacket on, justacore, waistcoat, breeches, cravat. We are literally seconds away from 1700 when I was born to, what year is it? 1948? What year is it? That's where we are roughly? Okay, good. Well, I'm dressed sort of like my Victorian counterpart, right? So we focus more on silhouette and little details that will sort of inform us as to the shape. We'll get back to this, because this is the thing that we have to really understand, because it moves so quickly. We start off, here we are in Restoration land, right? With that mantua, with the skirts pulled up, bustled towards the back, very triangular. And as I always say, in fashion, whatever's popular, we want to try to make a big statement after that to say we're more fashionable, right? And so the thing that becomes the most fashionable is our first gown, the sack gown. Can you see why it's probably called the sack? Can you look over here and maybe see a sack? Which one? The first one, right? When I say sack, it probably informs this idea of something unfit. Now, it does have some fit. It is tailored per se. However, what we really get is this idea from shoulder to hem almost has no interest in the waist at all, right? That's okay. And can we see, you know, I keep bringing up this term, déshabillé. Doesn't it look like a robe? Like a house robe, something you'd want? So we can see how that influences it. Now, when we get to Versailles, and I remember the thing I was going to say, and I was talking about this theatricality, we have to remember that these people are now presentational people. You know, we talked about the king. When he gets up in the morning, a whole group of people are sitting there waiting for him to help him get dressed. It becomes this theatrical event. And so these clothes often feel theatrical as well. And if we look at this, there is a majesty, a grand sweep, as I said in costume design the other day, to it. You get a sense in its movement, yes, that it would fill the space. So this gown, this outer part here, the sack, no fit through the waist from shoulder to hem. Are there silhouette changes to the natural body in this though? Is there any sort of romanticism, to use that term, exaggeration? What is it, Alana?
Like around the hip.
Side to side. So you remember when we were in Cavalier and I showed you that picture of the Infantata from Spain, and I said, and everybody was like, whoa, that's weird. And I'm like, hold on. Because we see a very similar identity here because it is about width. And what causes that width? What's the term? You remember? From the terms? That is exactly the term, panier, the breadbasket. Yes, that. The panier is a structural system that extends from side to side. We're used to looking at things like this if we're thinking about the Elizabethan, where we came from, where we have this identity that it's the entirety of the body, right? It's not, it's literally side to side. So when I turn this dress form, can you see that it's pretty flat side to side if we're looking at it from the side? But straight on, it has volume. So this panier, which we'll see many different versions of, is a structural idea underneath all of this that pushes the dress at the hip. We're going to see lots of pictures. I promise you, don't panic. Now, what else does this sack gown use on the body, in this case at least, that we've seen before? Anything here reminiscent of things we've seen before? Nothing? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say like the open skirt. I don't remember.
Okay, so it's an open gown. It can be an open gown. If we have an open gown, what does that reveal? Which we have also called the jupe. Excellent. We saw that here in the mantua, right? But now we go back to that idea of, look at the beautiful fabric. I only need a little bit of it. The rest of it can be crap, right? What's another thing that we see that sort of was involved in that déshabillé or sort of shows something that isn't really there? Yeah.
Oh, that isn't there? Never mind.
Well, no. But like, what's the job of this? What is that little triangle insertion called? We saw it. Yeah, go ahead. Stomacher, right. And what does it do? It pretends to visually be undergarments that aren't really there. We're going to see it a couple times. So see, even if we look here, we can see the stomacher, we can see the jupe. Even with that modeste, that overskirt, it feels like it's just sort of moving, but this swag that was pulled back is now extended. Make sense? Sack gown, also called the gown volant, the flying gown. Last thing that is part of every sack. This. Can you see that there is a pleating detail that's happening across the back? That we call the Watteau pleating. Now, the term Watteau pleating was not used in the time of the Rococo because Watteau was a contemporary, but he was an artist that when drawing often focused on the backs of people. And so we see this pleating and it just sort of gains that name. But can you see how it's a very intricate folded situation? Now, I will tell you the truth. When I first started studying this, I don't know, in the 18th century, I always kind of got the feeling that it was a cape, right? Doesn't it feel like it's kind of a separate piece? And in truth, in reality, there are some that represent that. But in the sack, and for the courses that we're sort of talking, or the clothes that we're talking about, it's actually the gown. Do you see that? See how it's one continuous piece like a robe? And it's just pleated into, what do we call that little section that supports things? The yoke, right? Can you see this little yoke right here? Just like my shirt, it's sewn onto a foundation that it hangs from. And so we have the sack. So the two big things about the sack is no fit from shoulder to hem. and it has the watteau pleats. The watteau pleats should imply, in your mind, that they are cut into the entirety of the gown. Does that make sense? First idea? Awesome. What are some disadvantages of the sack? Maybe from a wearing standpoint. Yeah.
Oh, walking through a doorway?
Well, okay, excellent. You picked it up earlier than other classes. I need my doorway. So what would be the challenge here? Even at this stage.
You have to turn.
Turn. And then turn again.
It
Is that
so
theatrical?
So theatrical.
No.
You
What do
don't
we-
think that's theatrical?
Well,
No, walking into a room like that?
David doesn't know theater.
But what would be more theatrical?
Striding in like a queen?
Right. And how do you want to do that? Straight on, right? So what would we need to do to these doors? We could make them wider, but what's even more theatrical than no, we're not going to cut the doors like it's Wile E. Coyote bursting through a wall.
That'd be great.
And now that I talk about it, you'll go, right. Whenever you see movies that take place in this period, we tend to see French doors. What do French doors do? Two doors that open up. Isn't that even more theatrical?
Yeah.
Presentational. And all I have to do is those doors open and I'm there and I just step forward. So yeah, width can be an option, a challenge. And we see this also in furniture. Can you imagine sitting in a desk such as ours in front of us? No, it's difficult. So we often see things like chairs without, I mentioned this in the restoration, but chairs without arms, because that would all crush you up. What might be another thing that we as people probably would sort of say, oh, this is fun to wear, and then after a while be like, I don't think I want to wear this anymore. Nothing?
I would say just like the tightness of it.
Tightness? Where do you see tightness?
Not tightness, like, do the sleeves like restrict?
A little bit, but that's a small price to pay for fashion, right?
Is it that every modern person hates the idea of a stay?
No, because that has nothing to do with the dress, right? That doesn't have anything to do with the gown.
I'm thinking about going to the bathroom.
Oh, easiest thing ever. Done.
Oh.
Done. That's all you have to do. We tend to want to show our bodies,
Yeah.
right? And yes, we will wear maxi dresses and things like that, but those tend to come and go, and we tend to keep bouncing back to this idea of, I want fit. Now, this is a very, we say, it's high fashion is pretty small in the big picture of the Rococo, but you can imagine this would take a lot of textile, right, to make. Are you just going to throw it away and have a new dress? No. So the next style that becomes most popular is called the gown française. Pretty easy to determine where that style came from, yes? Or the robe à la française. Where?
Spain.
Not Spain.
Ah!
Correct. Et c'est ça, et le robe à la française. Now, this is a work in project or process, so please do not judge too much on it, but it has all of the pieces. What does it share in common with the sack gown?
The back pleat?
Can we see the back pleat now, though? Maybe a little bit, but do we know that there's a back pleat in here? Okay, so let's just focus on what we see. What does it share with the sack?
The width and the stomacher?
Okay, so first of all, we see still the width. So we like, oh, we like that. Let's keep that. We see this triangularity of the stomacher playing along. And what kind of stomacher? What does this stomacher feature?
Oh, the split front?
Well, it is split front, but what do you remember what we call this? The ribbons à la shell, correct. The ladder. I keep trying to remember the Spanish word for it. Escolar? Escala. Thank you. But these ribbons à la shell coming down. And notice when this is not close, but when it's joined to the stomacher, doesn't it feel like a gown that is tied together with the ribbons, right, over our stay? So it is kind of seductive, even though we know the truth is that this gown would be sewn, well, first of all, the stomacher would be mounted onto our stay. Can you see how that would be mounted onto the stay, pulled taut, and then the dress would get sewn into place on each side. So once you're in this, guess what? You're in for good.
So would people have to have it sewn and like then have the stitches taken out?
Yeah.
And ooh, ugh.
Or you could do what I'm doing. Just pin it together.
I was like, they had pins back then.
Of course they did. Of course they did. All sorts of pins. They had straight pins, safety pins, all those good things. But pins were expensive. They did not use them in the same way that we sort of garbage them. They would be very important. We're going to see some pin work coming up. Now, notice that this gown is an open gown as well, showing off the underskirt that we call the jupe or the cyclé. Good. You can see that it is partial crap fabric, right? Now this one is special because this actually is a pocket dress.
I was gonna say, it looked like there were pockets in them.
So we call these pocket panier, the one that I showed before, because they have, see this room that's in there? I can hide stuff in there. A book.
Did they used to do
A kid.
that?
Oh, sure, wouldn't you?
I would, yeah.
But this one actually also has pockets. This is based on a real one, hidden in the seams. But I can't just have it, in a sense, in my gown, right? Because then it would just fall out. So I have to have it in my jupe as well, so that I can reach down through, and then into my pocket panier. So there we go. From the front, silhouette of hip is the same. Silhouette of the front is the same, but what is different? Okay, we have carefully manipulated the bodice, in a sense, through a series of pleats. Do you see these pleats? I've pinned them for the sake of it, because I haven't gotten around to finishing it. It's only 12 years old. What's the big deal? But do you notice? Huh?
I said I felt that. I have so many projects.
Oh, it's my life. That's what my whole house is. But you can see I could easily take the sack and convert it to this, correct? By just carefully manipulating the pleat. So as you can see, and this is also for our class, we're going to see why this is kind of wonky. But can you see how this is actually just the sack cut from shoulder to hem? And I hasten to use the word bodice because we think of this whole idea as the bodice, right? The whole thing. But the front part is brought towards the body. Now, where we're going to see this somewhat similar, as Daisy said, but also somewhat different. What does it have in the back? Okay, the Watteau pleating. But can you see, again, how we've manipulated this so it rides toward the body? But see how it's not a separate bodice? So that's how I like to determine it. There's no separate bodice. It's still like the sack where it's cut from shoulder to hem, but we use pleats to mold it to the silhouette of the waist. Underneath, this is just because it's there. Boop. Boop. We can see the stay, right? And do you notice how kind of conical that is? So we have to think about how that lays on the human body. Française. Yes.
Is asymmetricality in the sleeves just a finishing detail? Or
Yeah, it's just that if you notice, this one isn't actually sewn, but I did tack on part of it. And it's over here. But sometimes we see them. Actually, I do like to show this for those people who are really into full on costume history stuff. Do you notice how it's a shaped sleeve? So it sits into the crescent of the arm a little bit better. Imagine if this was like a t-shirt sleeve and it was cut straight across. the tiers, which we call engageant, would lay as gracefully, right? They tend to trail down. So thank you for pointing that out. What's up here? Right, but we have a good French name for it.
Okay. I guess not.
That's okay. I'm laughing. See, that's the thing with masks. You can't tell if I'm either giving you the gaze, the DTH gaze, or the laugh, and it's a laugh. Huh?
Is that patented?
What?
The DTH game?
No, unfortunately.
The parfait.
Perfect.
Contentment.
Okay, excellent way to remember it. Perfectly content. Content finish. Parfait contentement is how it would be pronounced in French. My French is sometimes a little bit more Inspector Clouseau than it may be Gerard Depardieu, but it's this little perfect finish. Can you imagine how and we will see pearls too, but can you see how this sort of fits with the aesthetic of it all? It shows décolletage, it gives us a finish, but it doesn't cover us up. And it feels like it's organically sort of there, right? Finally, this is fashionable, certainly, throughout a great deal of the period, but slowly it makes way to a third gown. And that third gown is this one all the way over here, the gown anglaise, or the gown, the robe l'anglaise. Anybody French that wants to tell me where that's from? Yeah?
Is that England?
England, excellent. Angleterre. So we can see a very different styling, because though we will see gown française in France and England and America, this is inspired by a much more simple gown in a lot of ways. And if we really look at the mantua, you can see that it's kind of like skipping over some of this stuff and just kind of going from A to B, right? What does it share with the two previous gowns? What are some things? Huh?
Still got the width.
Okay, we still have the width. So what's under there? Panier, excellent. What else? The jupe. So in this case, with it being an open gown, we're seeing the jupe. This jupe is very specific. It is a quilted jupe, which would keep you warm. Also helps keep body in it, right? Did you notice when I moved this, I forgot they were under there. A little secret. What's under there?
Pocket.
Yeah. So this is how pockets would work if you want to tie on a pocket. Look at that. Hey, right? But they're hidden underneath our modeste, right? What is different, though, from these two previous garments and this one? Do we see any style difference?
Ready to go first. Your top.
How do we say it at the same time?
Ready? 3, 2, 1.
The bodice is a
The
separate
movement
piece.
So first, yes. Do you notice how the bodice is cut separately from the skirt and then joined, unlike the gown française, where it's just manipulated over the body? And you can see how that is very similar to the mantua, right? And then this double mask thing is really, I talk too much, I guess. What was the thing that you were going to say, Brian?
The fabric, just like compared to the two of them, it's more like matted.
Okay. Though the gown anglaise, actually, you know what? You bring up an excellent point. The gown anglaise often is much more simple in the textiles. This just happens to be the textile, but we could make it out of silk if we wanted to. But there is a simplicity that gets carried over in a lot of ways into even the textiles, where we start to see these things highly decorated, maybe perhaps more simple. Now, this one has a fake stomacher in it, which actually has a name from the period, but you notice how a lot of times we see these anglaises without any sort of stomacher in them. They are just a bodice with a skirt attached to it. This one happens to, again, be an open gown, though they can be closed. And so when we move, what we really see is the cutting away to the fit of the body, the tailoring it more towards the body, becoming more classic. What's the other thing that this does not have or makes it different from these two garments? It's probably back here. Go ahead, Mel.
Pleating, it starts with the
Yeah, no, that's
W.
great. What doesn't it have? Watteau pleats. It fits. You remember when I was saying bodice? This is what I think of as a bodice. It starts in the front, works its whole way around, right? This just feels like a manipulation of that fabric. This really feels like a bodice. But do you notice that there's kind of this weird seaming here that feels like the Watteau pleats? In fact, we'll see some gowns that move into Anglais territory. But you have to imagine that there are little things that kind of live in between all of these, and we're making them ourselves so we can do anything. But I could pretty much make that gown by securing these permanently, right? And now it's Anglaise, because we don't see it. But it's hard to see in painting sometimes. That's why I definitely need the 3 dimensions here, because we have to decipher, because more often than not, we're just looking at one view. We don't have the luxury to say, could you please turn around? Can I look and see if that has a waist seam in it? And they're playing around with it too. But this is how I break the 3 down. Does that make sense? Awesome. Yeah.
Is this traditionally an evolution of the same dress, or is it different?
I think it is more a day-to-day change. The queen decided one day that she didn't want it volant and maybe pin those down, you know, or it is even more so a change kind of every day, but we see it move gradually throughout the period where we go from sac being fashionable to then the Française being fashionable to the Anglaise being fashionable. And it also helps us to understand, because the idea of French versus English will be very important when we get to the next period talking about fashion. Because as we know, French garments are dangerous. Because if you can be recognized as French, that means you could lose your head, right? In the streets. But if you pretend to be English, or if people think you're English, you have a much better chance of getting away. Make sense? Awesome. One last dress that was in the lecture that is actually pretty simple to understand, and we'll see pictures of it, is a term polonaise. Now, does anybody remember what polonaise, the definition of it was? If you don't, that's okay. It's taking almost any dress, because this dress has a secret. Not a secret, a secret. There's my gum. I've been looking for that for like an hour. Ready? Turning it into a polonaise, a walking dress. Yeah, well, and it's super easy. And I like to think of this as the office to evening dress. You know, I can walk out in the garden, not get myself dirty, and then, oh, come on, there we go. And then boom, I can let it down when I'm inside and I feel more formal, right? So the polonaise is a casual dress where we bring up the skirts on 3 levels, ultimately. Okay. Boop, 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 boop. Would you mind turning off the lights for me? Thank you. Okay. So now we're moving into history. Let's go history of clothes. Is that the right button? Is that the right button? Are any of these the right button? There we go. Okay, so for those of you at home, I'm going into full slide mode, so I'm sorry. But if you have a question, please scream. And then I'm leaving full mode. Go away, go away. There we go. I got to get this chat window far, far away. It blocks everything. Okay, here we go. So when we talk about this, we do have to acknowledge the artists of the period because they very, very much define how the world looks. Chardin, Watteau, Boucher, Fragonard. Pretty obvious where they're from. France.
France, yeah. Okay.
Gainsborough, Copley, Reynolds, primarily English, and Copley is American. If you've ever been to Boston, you've probably heard the name Copley a couple times. You go to the MFA, They have a very large Copley collection. So I like to use those. Those are great hallmarks of people to look at when we're getting there. Now, I always have to start again with Versailles, because we're hitting maximum Versailles right now. This is looking out on one of the gardens. And the reason I show this picture, if you notice, can you see the trees? Now, we can recognize them as trees, yes, right? But can you see how they've been manipulated to become something kind of more beautiful in a way? Turned into boxes, topiaries? But everything is planned and thought out. We're using these organic ideas to help make the world better in so many ways. This is the most important thing I want you to remember for the entirety of the day. These are the cats of Versailles. This little biscuit here we call Brioche, and this little fat one down here we call Mr. Stinky. That's not really their names, but there are lots of feral cats all around Versailles. You keep running into them. So here's a bedroom, and look at the formality of it. But do you notice that it has balance and order and weight in a very different way? Do you notice how it's cohesive? Can you easily see one of these pieces walking into that space in a lot of ways? And even though it's grand, they have whittled away sections of it to try to make it more airy and more light, to give it the sense of heft, but also at the same time to break it down to its finest elements. So if we look, can you see the bed is on a platform, almost like a stage, right? We're going to even see ones that have true stages in them, like this one. So there's the king's bed, and there's actually a gate around it on this platform, this dais, which everybody sits around here. Remember all those stools I showed you before? They're all waiting. And then the gates open up and the theatrical presentation begins. Look at, doesn't this look like a theater? You know, I love it. And this is the level of detail we're talking about. You know, it's not just that the curtains maybe match the wallpaper, but if you notice the tassels match the fabric, which matches the wallpaper, which matches the furniture, you know, it's everything's thought about, but it's its own entity, right? They coordinate, but they're not matchy. And here's the perfect illustration in a lot of ways of this first stage. This is the Declaration of Love by Troy, Troy. And what are the females wearing in this? What are the women wearing in this? We know we have 4 gown options, so sacks. Can you see how there's, even here, though we can see the arm nestled in it, it just feels like that's just being pushed in, right? It doesn't feel like there's fit. If we look at the woman here in the center in white, you can see that there's lots of extra fabric. It feels very robe-like, very déshabillé. You can see that in a couple cases, the one in the center and the one back here, actually, you can see that there is a stomacher in there. And notice that those stomachers are very organic. They look like flowers or something growing. We know they're lace or ribbons, but we want that feeling. Where do we see even more organic? In the textile? Doesn't it feel like it's growing up the body? It feels natural. It feels like the environment. And feel the whole mise en scène of this painting, right? The place, the space, the feeling of space. It all coordinates, but everybody has their own little part of it. We can see a jupe or a cyclé. If we look down on her foot, can you see the mule? You'd imagine that mules would be incredibly important here, right? With all this fabric, you would want to be able to slide into something if you needed to. We can see the hair is brought up to show much more of the neck. Notice these 2 ladies are wearing caps on their heads. If we look back here, we can see the silhouette. Even though we can't see the details, we can tell this is Rococo, right? Because of how wide that feels. We can assume underneath pannier, we can assume that there are other details that we'll talk about. Notice on the gentleman, we can basically see the same things: justaucorps, waistcoat, breeches. And what do we call when somebody is wearing 3 pieces that match, like if this gentleman is, a jacket, a waistcoat, and a trousers? What do we call that today? A suit. And that word comes from, in the lecture? Ditto. Well, okay, we can call that a ditto, 3 pieces, What's the other word? Suit, actually just add me on the end. Suite. A suite. What is a suite? There are things that are intended to be together, right? We could have a suite of rooms. We could have the Nutcracker suite, where things are intended to be played. If you thought it was SWEET, I'm sorry. But they're intended to be together, and that's where the word suit comes from. A suite of clothes intended to be worn together ultimately becomes the word suit. And we can see how that happens here. If we look at this gentleman, we can see that's not a suite all the way on the end, because we see a kind of camel or a copper colored waist or justacore. Then we see a blue waistcoat, and then we see kind of a brown breech, right? Okay, but notice that shape, and notice it's perfect to see right here on the blue what's trailing down the back. The Watteau pleats. And can you see how it's one continuous dress? It's not a hot glued cape on the shoulders. So what do we need underneath this? The stay. We're going to see just a few different versions of the stay, but the thing I want you to take away is before we thought about just wrapping the torso, can you see all these little channels now? All those little things? There are bits of material, and I use that word correctly, in those. It could be boning, meaning whalebone. It could be reed. It could be rattan, but it is formed into this shape because you can see the triangularity that wants to be used. I'm going to skip over, sorry, because I forgot I moved that. Even here on this child's stay, is it going to go back? No. On this child's stay, you can see, or a very tiny person, can you see all those channels? So you can imagine how this is molding our body into position. And as we move along, ultimately ending up here, which still is pretty triangular, but can you see all those channels? And can you see how they're all going different ways? Because they're controlling and shaping the body in a very different way. Looking quickly, I just want to show you where we started, right? If we look all the way here where it says 1700, can we see the mantua there? And then as it's moving along, we can start to see how it's relaxing and then slowly turning. This kind of bumps around a little bit more than I really love, but that's okay. Into the gown anglaise, right? Little parts change, little things change. I sometimes be careful of paintings telling us exactly the date of when that was worn, because just like our projects, that painting could have been sitting in a field for 12, 14 years. But again, we can sort of see that timeline happening of how it moves closer to the body and extends off. So we have our stay. Here's another form. And notice these little tabs around here, that helps support the pannier. They can either be flipped up on top to help move over the garment, or they can be tied underneath to actually keep the panniers from slipping around. And here we can see kind of the first undergarment, series of undergarments. If you notice, first we have our shift or our chemise, right? A linen garment, our hygienic garment. Then on top of that, we have our stay. And notice that it has that basque front because ultimately we're going to be sewing on a stomacher maybe. And then what are on the sides? Pannier, just like the pannier we would see here. Here we can see another form. Now that's, again, one of the things I want you to understand. It's not all pannier have to be like this because we never intended to see them. So in this case, we see more of like a dome shape, but really we could do anything. I could take two troublesome children and strap them to the sides of my body if I needed to, if it gave me the silhouette that I wanted. Exactly. Want and what's the other one? This one is one. This is ignorance. Thank you. But anything to create that silhouette. We can even start to see these ideas much like the farthingales, if you remember that from the beginnings in the Elizabethan, but creates things that are much more structural, because as we see, we will have gowns like this. These feel fancy, but court gowns are exceptionally wide and exceptionally detailed. And you've maybe seen them in memes because and you'll see it when it comes up probably, but they look like a flat screen TV could fit under them. They're so big. Do I need to just tell you what memes are? I'm just assuming that you all, no, I'm kidding. I know you don't think I'd. This one's more like a skirt in its entirety, but still pannier. And here are just some other versions of it. See, anything that will hold our skirt out and hopefully be somewhat lightweight will really inform us how to create that silhouette. And we could also see some beautiful stay along with this as well. So this is actually a stay as well. It looks like a jacket, right? But this was intended to be worn as an undergarment that the garment would go on top of. And just like waistcoats, remember when I said they don't have sleeves unless they have sleeves? Every once in a while, we'll see stay that have sleeves as well. And that's okay. I like to show the variety of things. We know what a stay is. We know what it does. So what are we looking at here? Stomacher, exactly. And you can see the tabs where that could be pinned on or sewn on to the stay. And then the gown, we even have like a little marking all the way around it, just like that one, to show us where the gown should align to, right? And we can see how that would fit on the body, little tabs. And stomachers are great little projects. You know, if you're practicing needlework or you want to make something for a friend, you can make a stomacher. You could also make a pair of pockets. This is a very decorative stomacher. We're not going to worry about the gown right yet, but notice how organic that feels. It feels like it's just growing right up the body. Now, we can't see the back of this dress, right? So it's hard for us to tell exactly what it is. What gown isn't this, though? It's definitely not a sack, right? Because it does conform into the waist. If we look carefully, I can tell this is probably a Française, because can you see how the textile goes, continues down past the waist? There is a seam there. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to pretend we don't see that. This would probably feel more Française, but the only way I could determine if it was Française is if what?
The bodice and
Well, there's one other thing that would really is the deal breaker with between Anglaise and
oh,
Française.
yeah,
The pleating in the back, right? So can I see that? So we can't really tell what this is, and that's okay. As I always say, even in my history, or if I go to museums, they argue about it all the time. I'll see a dress mounted at the Metropolitan Museum and they'll call it a Française. They'll mount it at FIT and they call it an Anglaise or a sac, or, you know, I mean, it's okay, sure. So I've tried to sort of break it down, but what are we looking at here?
a sack.
Yeah, definitely a sack. And you can see why we call them flying gowns. Look at how big we want this to look. And you can see that the pannier situation is more like, we might think of like the 1860s, like a hoop situation, but really trying to create permanent flying. And if we look in the back, we can clearly see the Watteau pleat. Here we can see them a little bit more demure sack, but can you see how it has almost no fit through that? Now it does have pleating, but it's not molded to the body. It's really just sort of feeling shoulder to hem. And you can see how each of those pleats, it's not a tabard, right? It's not a piece of cloth, a poncho, creating those lines. It's really that it's all released into one big garment. Here we can see what? Okay, so can we tell what this outfit is? What kind of dress this is?
Française.
Why is it Française?
Because of the pleating and the yoke and the fit of the waist.
Right. Look at that. Nancy Drew. I love it. Now, the other reason I show this, can you notice how the pattern is off? Oh, it makes me crazy. But I obsess about patterns and like patterns matching and right to left and all this stuff to a degree that sometimes I hurt myself. But then I see things like this beautiful gown, and I'm like, okay, they didn't care, so maybe I don't need to. Now, yeah. So here we see a dress. We can't, I can't step into this picture and be like, can you lift your arm? But can you see how there's more of a shadow of a waist in this than sackiness? So my first instinct would be to call it a Française. I need to investigate more, but I probably would go to Française over sac. Notice that it has the ribbons of the shell down the front. That's not attached to the dress, to the stomacher. We can see that it's an open gown. In this case, notice that the jupe coordinates, but isn't necessarily the same. It has some details that are the same, but can you see like there are 3 tiers of ruffling underneath? I mean, it's hard to see, but you can see that they're sort of mixing it up. But how do we know it's a Française? Right. And then right here, we can see sky, showing us that it isn't a sack. And then we can see these ruffles, these tiers that I call engageant, tiers of lace that jet out of the sleeve. And then this is what it looks like close up. So we might look at this and go, what a beautiful print. Nope, that is embroidery.
Wow.
So that's all embroidery, my friends. I know.
How long that took.
Well, it doesn't matter because you have nimble hands to do that for you, right? I show this because it's a little bit of a close-up. I can tell that there's a little bit of shadow in there telling me this is probably a Française. And then can you see how the Watteaus are sort of sneaking around? That's kind of how I navigate it. But I wanted to show you the neckline more importantly. Can you see how there's like that little ruffle around the edge? That's the tatai. You know, the touch here, the look here. This idea of a little enticing bit of lace around the neckline. What do we see at the neck? Black?
The perfect content.
Yes.
I can't say it.
The perfect content. Exactly. The choker, the ruffled choker. We can see the engageant, right? The tiers. Can you see all those tiers? Really beautiful. In yellow. Here we can see another dress and we can tell that this is Française. See, this is like where I would call it Française, even though, can you see that little bit of a seam there? But it's not really defining a bodice per se. It just feels like it's moving the skirt. A cheap way to solve this. I could be wrong, but you notice in this case, like the Watteau pleats are kind of pushing themselves towards the body. It's only just a little ways, and then it's probably just going to be touching the body. Here we can see a court gown. Again, we can't see what's happening back there, so we don't know if it is Française or it's Anglaise, but we get a sense of the silhouette that is happening. Here, I believe this is from Toronto, and this is one of Marie Antoinette's dresses, they believe. I could be wrong. It's a yellow dress, and I've seen so many of these dresses in my real life that sometimes I panic. But we can see how that is fit to the body. Can you see how there's air here, sky here, no sky? So what dress does this have to be, at least? One of Française, right? Because we can see that that isn't sack. We can see that that is Watteau that we're looking back. So, but look at the decoration on it. Can you see how the jupe coordinates, but it has a different story? Yellow is so popular in this period. So here we go. Looks like stealing a 50-inch TV, right? But that's a court gown. That's, you know, the extremity of how these look, because you would want to be as formal as possible. What I love here too is look at this terrible fit. Just like blah, 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 blah. Anyway, here's another court gown, maybe a little bit more to our liking, but you can see the stomacher in there. You can see that it is full. If you look very carefully, you can see that this is a Française. Can you see the Watteau pleating sort of peeking forward? But I wouldn't trick you. I wouldn't be like, is this a Française or an Anglaise? Because it can't perfectly tell. But, you know, training your eye to see the little details can help. But you can understand, especially if something was this wide, it probably would be easier to build a front that was fitted, hot glue a skirt on that, and then the back is pleated in, because that's a turn, my friends. That's impossible to sew. And here we see, you know, somebody visiting. How glamorous would it be to walk out a door like this? You know, no, but we can see how extreme that is. Notice here this décolletage. This is when we're getting really late. It seems like we can see a little bit of Watteau action happening here, but do you notice that this one actually has a seam? Can you see that if you look really carefully, it feels like a separate bodice? So that would be one of those that probably I would give points for either two. But But this is what we think of. It's impossible to tell fully what it is. Her arms are covering. Who cares? But we can acknowledge the Rococo. Notice again the organic feeling. It feels like this dress is growing on her body. We see the ribbons à l'échelle. We see the tatillis. We see the engagement. We see the mules all coming together. Notice even the decoration that is in here feels like it matches the dress, even though it probably doesn't. A woman outside in the garden. Notice how she feels as wild in a lot of ways. The dress itself. Notice that this all feels like plants and leaves, but all in perfectly pink silk. Notice the tears, the ruffles. Notice the, again, ribbons à l'échelle down the front, but all sort of cavalier and messy because it feels as wild as the world she's in. Parfait contentement. Right here we see the engagement. Little shoe poking out. It's beautiful. It's Reynolds, I think. Who cares? And then, you know, one of my favorite paintings, the swing. And we get a sense of like the volume, even though she's sitting on this little thing, that there's just billowing textile in it. It's a very scandalous painting, as this gentleman is looking up her skirt, but you can see that there's a ribbon holding up her hosiery. And then you can see her mule has flipped off her foot. Because when you're swinging, of course that's going to happen. So here we can see that transition, right? This is really, you know, I would still call this a Watteau pleat, but it's really getting close. It's getting so close that it's really just feeling like seaming at that point. And here we can see an anglaise. Can you see the seam there? I've highlighted these in red, so you can, but you can see even in the seaming, it kind of references the Watteau pleat. And in many of these dresses, if you notice, can you see how this is one single piece still that goes all the way down into the skirt? It sort of, the bodice kind of stops like right there, but just a little interesting event. Here we can see definitely anglaise, right, my friends? We can see a very clear bodice. We see a very clear skirt. The bodice stops, the skirt's pleated into it. Definitely anglaise. What I love about this as well is this scarf that is tucked into the neck, very sheer. We'll talk about that next time because we only have like 8 terms next time. But notice that wearing the pearls around the neck like the parfait contentement. Notice this beautiful little cap here. And this one almost feels a little bit like the fontage in a way, right? Because it's kind of peeking up, but perfect. And then even in a sense, an apron on the front, which is kind of the symbol of demure, but beautiful. Engagement, oh, gorgeous, beautiful. What kind of gown? Anglaise, right? Very clearly see bodice, skirt, open gown, but you couldn't even tell probably walking in the street because it just feels like one dress. This one is, I believe, an anglaise as well, but you can see you can decorate it up. You can tart it up a little bit if you need to. Here's another one. So Brian was kind of right when he was talking about the, you know, if you look at these two, nope, wrong way, wrong way, wrong way. You look at those two, they're not quite as fancy feeling, right? They're very much English, kind of boring. That's okay. I'm English. I can say that. Here we can see even the sense of the scarf kind of acting as the stomacher, which I love. And here we can see where we end up very clearly anglaise, right? And notice that it has a back basque as well. And I'd mentioned this in the lecture, or the terms, this idea of a false rump. And do you notice how not only do we have the panniers, but it's kind of giving us a little, you know, Sir Mix-a-Lot back there, right? That lower back and then kind of two things. So we could put pads in there. Here we see a polonaise. So really the polonaise is just bringing it up. Sometimes they have Watteau pleats, sometimes they don't, but it's really about that idea of lifting that modeste, that over skirt. Here, certainly not super clear, but you can see we've sort of tucked the skirt up a little bit. Now look at this one really quick. Does it look like Rococo? But kinda?
I mean, the organic feel with
Yeah.
the flowers.
Yeah. Now, if I said this is actually a Rococo dress, you would immediately say, what kind of dress is this? Okay. Bodice skirt, easy. But sometimes you have to imagine these textiles are very expensive. This is a dress that was rebuilt almost 100 years later because that textile was so beautiful and organic. So it's an 18th century textile, taking one of these things, taking it apart, recutting it, rebuilding it into an 1860s dress. And the key to me, notice the sleeve, just that little, right? And then notice the neckline feels very different. But we have to be careful, but we can also see things in other places that we didn't know. That's a quilted petticoat. You can see that that would add volume and warmth. And they could even be in silk. And here we can see a jacket, you know, if we need separates. Some days, you know, we just need separates. Here's that pin. Remember I was talking about the pin? That's how that apron is being held in place with pins. And if we look, I think it's on, oh, it's another Chardin. Oh, no, it is right there. Can you see that little line? That's showing you that it crosses over and pins down the side. So anyway, here we can see quilted petticoat, pockets, and then this sort of at-home stay that we call jumps. And it's just a casual sort of stay to help mold the body. But you can see it's still kind of flexible. It's soft. But you would still want something to give you formality. But who wants to wear this chasing those stupid kids around all day? We can see the tate even in there, and we can see a bit of the shift. Here's a pocket. Cute. Little thing to make for a friend. Here we can see a different type of jacket, but doesn't that look like somebody just got out the scissors and was like, I hate my robe française. That's what I love about it. Some shoes. We saw this shoe before. Sorry. I don't know how hairstyles got in there. Here we can see a mule. Again, look how beautiful and decorated those are. We can only imagine the dress would coordinate with it. And here we see an even more extreme version. Gorgeous? Yeah. Here we can see caps. So this is a great illustration because we tend to think of, if you've ever been in an Oliver or some sort of play where they give you a cap because you're a maid, they tend to throw these little circles with elastic in them. We call them mob caps. That's very theatrical. If you look at this, can you see that it's actually tailored? It has a band, it has ruffles. It's not just a drawstring good to go. And if we look here, we can see a very small one. And then you can see different forms of that cap, but see, they're very structured. They're not just this little doily that we hot glue on our head. Here we can see another one. Okay, men, we have all of 7 seconds to get through men, and we can do it. But what we're gonna see is that silhouette slim. And if you notice, triangular, just like the Rococo, or sorry, the Restoration. And slowly, do you notice how we get rid of most of the stuff? And our justacore, our waistcoat, and our trouser pretty much just end up being fit to the body. And notice that the waistcoat, just like the 1920s, gets higher and higher and higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. So that's how we can really tell what period we're looking at. How fit is the coat? How long is the waistcoat? So it's easy to scoot through men's clothes in this period. Because here we see Restoration. Remember that low waist that I had mentioned? We can see the jabot or the cravat, but we see very triangular. And as we move along, triangular, right? Long waistcoat, probably Rococo. Oh, that's starting to shape, right? Notice the waistcoat's a little higher. Now we're starting to see some of the trousers. What kind of outfit is this? A suite, correct, or a ditto? And you notice this right here, this tie around the neck, that's called a solitaire. It's tied over the cravat or the jabot. And it's thought to come from the idea of there's a hair bag that could be worn. It's in my very first thing called the crapeau. And you would take the ribbons, it's just like a drawstring bag, and then you take the ribbons and tie them around. Remember that red tie we saw in the Restoration? It's just taking that place of that. And then we can see the tricorn hat. We all know that as New Englanders, right? And can you tell how late this is? How fit that justacore is and how short the waistcoat is? Now we know we're in the late 60s, early 70s, beginning of the 80s, because it's moved up. But notice still the organic story on it. That's all embroidery, my friends. So if you look, that you thought about those little chain stitch flowers, that's nothing. This is all very impeccably hand embroidered, down to the point where the pocket itself is embroidered. And you can see it all the way down. Look at the waistcoat. You can see that that's embroidered, and the pocket is embroidered as well. Part of that organic world. This is what it looks like from the back. And you can see that triangularity, in a sense, is just shifted towards the back. You think about a man's suit jacket today, or any suit jacket, often has that pleat, right? Give you a little swing back there so you can sit down. Basically no different, but smoother. Here we see a very simple justacore. We can see no collar. We can see the cravat around the neck. We can see the jabot, which is a cravat made of lace, sort of over that. But here, can you see the capo, that hair bag? He's just tied it all in bows back here instead of bringing it forward. Here we can see a suite. We can tell this is a little bit later because we're starting to see a bit of a collar on it. That's another thing that'll happen, but we talk about it next time, a little bit of a stand. But we see probably what is a suite or a ditto, right? Jacket, waistcoat. We see the cravat. We see a bow back here, either with a Q or with a capo. Somebody very artistic. Good, we have 5 more minutes. We can get through this, no problem. I love this one because we can really see how it's going to transition into the next period. Can you see how everything's going to start to move up a little bit? It feels like it's growing up, but notice it's this very beautiful white satin, not overly decorated buttons all the way to the neck. The only thing might be here, that waistcoat that will eventually show, but everything else will start to get much more plain. We can see the military influence today from this period, right? Because we could look at this and say, oh, we kind of know what's going on, but you can see how the military will in some ways kind of stay here, especially for dress uniforms. But you can see how that justacore is folded over, creating that revere. Here we see the waistcoat. There we see the breeches. Here we see a piece of a waistcoat that was never constructed. So they would actually embroider the textile first with the shape of the waistcoat first. Then they would cut it apart and sew it. I wouldn't have a waistcoat already made and be like, let's embroider. They would do it flat. And you can see where that pocket might go, right? That little space in there. But see how it also feels organic, like it's growing up the body? This one is done with the textile. This is actually, the textile is woven this way, which I think is really fascinating, but beautifully done. And if you notice, the pockets actually aren't real. I mean, they are pocket flaps, but there's actually no pocket in there because we don't want that to sag. You can see on my waistcoat, right? After you use them for a little while, put stuff in them, what happens? They start getting like that. Does that look good? No, we want nice and sharp. Earliest or latest of what we've looked at so far?
Later,
How come?
because of how short it is.
Right.
And the collar.
Yeah, the collar. We were not going to talk about that, but you're right. You're right. No, but you can see how short this is. This is very close to what I'm wearing today, right? Practically, only thing that's different is it's double-breasted. But this is how, through this period, we basically get from here to here, even though I'm a Victorian guy. Whoa, back, mister. Déshabillé, the banyan, this house robe. We can see that it's paired with other things, but the turban, the cravat around the neck, very Rococo, but still very beautiful. We can see how hairstyles, here we are in the Restoration. Can you see how they kind of deflate? And then by the time we get to the beginning of the 19th century, wigs kind of go away, except for special occasions. And then in some countries, we're going to see very slight variants. Does anybody know where this is from?
Oh, the Black Plague?
No, but masks were used because plagues were still around.
Okay.
But this is a Venetian Carnival scene.
Oh, wow.
And so we often see this sort of art when it's related to Venice and Carnival. Are we looking at a man, a woman, non-binary? We don't know, because this is obviously a disguise, right? So if we would look at the shoes and go, well, maybe it's a woman, or oh, that looks like a skirt. It could be anything. That's what's fun about disguises. Okay, and then just for whimsy, I love to throw some miserable children in there, meaning they just look so uncomfortable. But can you see that even in this case, the children would need to be stayed or corseted and shaped? You can even see the little baby seems to have some sort of boning in that. And we can see that they're, in this case, just little representations of adults, right? Including the boy from the solitaire through the cravat, the kamika, the waistcoat, the jacket, the justacore, the breeches, the shoes. And then if you don't notice the creepy cat who's going to eat the bird, then you have not been paying attention. Okay? So my friends, we did it with exactly 4 seconds to lose.